In 1557, the most powerful empire on earth declared bankruptcy. Not a minor financial setback. Complete bankruptcy. The Spanish crown, which controlled half of Europe, all of South America, vast territories in Asia, and received literal shiploads of gold and silver every month from the New World, announced it could not pay its debts. The bankers in Genoa and Augsburg were shocked. How does the richest empire in human history go broke? How does a nation that controls the world's gold mines run out of money? It seemed impossible. It was like a water company dying of thirst. But here's what makes this truly strange. The bankruptcy wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Spain would declare bankruptcy again in 1575, then 1596, then 1607, then 1627. By 1666, Spain had declared bankruptcy 9 times in just over a century. Each time, the empire was richer in gold. Each time, it was poorer in power. You've been told that wealth comes from resources, that nations with gold become powerful, that control of commodity exports creates prosperity. Spain had more gold and silver than any nation in history. Between 1500 and 1650, approximately 180 tons of gold and 15,000 tons of silver flowed from the Americas into Spanish ports. The Spanish treasure fleet was the envy of every nation on earth. Pirates risked their lives to capture even one ship. European powers went to war for access to this wealth. Yet Spain, the empire that owned the mines, collapsed. While its treasure vaults filled with American silver, its economy hollowed out. Its people grew poorer. Its military weakened. Its industries died. By 1600, Spain was the sick man of Europe, despite being the richest. What if I told you that the gold didn't make Spain powerful? What if the gold was the poison? What if the mechanism that destroyed Spain in the 16th century is the exact same mechanism destroying oil-rich nations today? What if we're watching the Spanish Empire collapse in slow motion again and again in Venezuela, in Nigeria, in Russia, in every nation cursed with commodity wealth? In the next 20 minutes, you'll see how this works. You'll understand the hidden mechanism that turns natural resources into national curses. You'll see why Spain's bankers kept lending to a bankrupt empire. You'll understand why inflation, not invasion, destroyed the most powerful military force on earth. And you'll see why this pattern repeats over and over whenever a nation discovers that its soil contains wealth. This is the story of how gold destroyed an empire, and how it's destroying empires still. In 1492, Spain was not wealthy. It was a newly unified kingdom, exhausted from centuries of internal war. The reconquest of Iberia from Muslim rule, had just concluded after 700 years. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, ruled a fractured nation of competing regions, languages, and loyalties. Castile and Aragon had been separate kingdoms until their marriage united them. The nobility was powerful and resistant to central control. The economy was agricultural and medieval. Spain had no industry to speak of, no banking system, no manufacturing base. The Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Florence, dominated trade and finance in Europe. The German banking houses, particularly the Fuggers of Augsburg, controlled the flow of capital. Spain was peripheral. It was a military power, yes, with battle-hardened soldiers from the Reconquista, but it was not economically sophisticated. It was not rich. Across Europe, the late 15th century was a time of severe monetary shortage. There simply wasn't enough gold and silver in circulation. The medieval mines of Central Europe were depleting. Trade was expanding, but the money supply was not. Prices were low. Economic growth was constrained by the physical scarcity of precious metals. Kings and merchants alike complained of the shortage of coin. Credit was expensive because capital was genuinely scarce. This was the economic reality when Columbus sailed west in 1492. He was not looking for a new continent. He was looking for gold. Specifically, he was looking for a route to the gold and spices of Asia. The Ottoman Empire controlled the eastern trade routes, and Europe needed an alternative. Columbus promised Ferdinand and Isabella that he would find gold. That was the pitch. That was the mission. And find he did, but not in Asia. In America. The Spanish discovered gold in the Caribbean first, then silver in Mexico. Then, in 1545, the unimaginable Potosí, a mountain in present-day Bolivia that was essentially solid silver. The richest silver deposit ever discovered in human history. Spanish chroniclers described it as a miracle, a gift from God, proof of divine favor. The Spanish crown established a simple system. 20% of all precious metals mined in the Americas belonged to the king. This was called the quinto real, the royal fifth. Private miners and conquistadors could keep the rest. So they mined, and mined, and mined. By the 1550s, the flow of silver became a flood. The treasure fleets, flotas, sailed from America to Seville twice a year, carrying tons of silver. The Spanish government didn't have to tax its people. It didn't have to develop industries. It didn't have to build a sophisticated economy. It just had to wait for the ships to arrive. It seemed like magic. Spain had stumbled into infinite wealth. A money printer, a cheat code for empire. No nation in history had ever possessed such an advantage. The Spanish called it la buena fortuna, the good fortune. But economic systems don't work on fortune. They work on mechanisms. And the mechanism that was about to unfold would destroy Spain more effectively than any foreign army ever could. The silver began arriving in significant quantities in the late 1540s. At first, it felt like salvation. The Spanish crown, under Charles V, was fighting wars on multiple fronts, against France, against the Ottoman Empire, against Protestant rebels in Germany. Wars are expensive. Soldiers need pay. Supplies need purchase. Fortifications need building. And Charles needed money. The silver provided it. Instantly. No need to negotiate with the Cortes, the Spanish parliament. No need to convince nobles to contribute. No need to raise taxes on a resistant population. The king simply waited for the next treasure fleet. In 1556, Charles V abdicated, exhausted from decades of war. His son, Philip II, inherited the throne and the empire. Philip also inherited the silver, and the wars, and the debts. By 1557, just 1 year into his reign, Philip faced a crisis. The royal treasury was empty despite the silver arriving. How? The answer is simple. Philip's father had already spent it. Charles had borrowed heavily from German and Italian bankers, using future silver shipments as collateral. The silver arriving in 1557 was already pledged to creditors. Philip inherited an empire and a mortgage. In 1557, Philip declared bankruptcy. He announced a decreto, a decree suspending payments to creditors. The bankers were furious. But what could they do? Philip controlled the silver mines. He controlled the source. Surely the debt could be restructured. Surely the silver would keep flowing. And it did. The silver kept arriving. More each year. By the 1560s, Spain's money supply was expanding rapidly. Prices began to rise. Not dramatically at first. Just a slow, steady increase. Bread cost a little more. Cloth cost a little more. Labor cost a little more. Nobody understood why. Most assumed it was temporary. But the mechanism was already in motion. Spain was experiencing the first stages of what historians would later call the price revolution. Between 1500 and 1600, prices in Spain would rise by approximately 250%. Not because of war, not because of famine, because of the silver. Here's how it worked. Silver entered Spain through Seville. The crown took its 20%. Private merchants took the rest. But what do you do with silver? You spend it. You buy things. Spanish nobles bought luxury goods from France and Italy. Spanish merchants bought manufactured products from the Netherlands and Germany. Spanish consumers bought grain and textiles from abroad. Spain was flooded with money, but Spain wasn't producing much. Its economy was still medieval. Agriculture, yes. Some wool, some wine, but no advanced manufacturing. No sofisticate industrias. The Italian and German and Flemish craftsmen made the goods. Spanish silver bought them. So Spanish silver flowed out of Spain almost as fast as it flowed in. It flowed to Italy, to Germany, to the Netherlands, to France. And in those countries, the silver had an effect. It increased their money supply too. Prices rose across Europe. Inflation spread like a contagion, but hit Spain first and hardest. Because Spain received the silver first, Spanish prices rose faster than everyone else's, which meant Spanish products became expensive. Spanish wool cost more than English wool. Spanish wine cost more than French wine. Spanish labor cost more than Italian labor. Spanish exports collapsed. Who would buy expensive Spanish goods when cheaper alternatives existed? By the 1570s, Spain was importing almost everything and exporting almost nothing except silver. The trade deficit exploded. Silver arrived and silver left. Spanish merchants and manufacturers couldn't compete. Why struggle to produce cloth in Spain when you could import it cheaper from Flanders? Why invest in Spanish workshops when Italian goods were superior and cheaper? Spanish industry withered. The economy became a pass-through. Silver came in, goods came in, silver went out. Meanwhile, Philip II kept fighting wars. He fought the Ottomans in the Mediterranean. He fought Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. He fought England. He fought France. Each war was more expensive than the last. By the 1570s, military expenses consumed almost all crown revenue. Philip borrowed more. The bankers, primarily the Genoese banking houses, lent more. They knew Philip had the silver mines. The collateral was real. The silver would keep arriving. So they charged high interest rates, yes, but they kept lending. By 1575, Philip faced another crisis. Debt service was consuming nearly 40% of royal income. The treasure fleet that year was smaller than expected. The bankers, sensing danger, tightened credit. Philip couldn't pay his soldiers in the Netherlands. The army of Flanders, unpaid and angry, mutinied and sacked Antwerp. Philip declared bankruptcy again. 1575, the second time in 18 years. The bankers restructured the debt, writing down interest by 38%. They had no choice. What else could they do? The alternative was losing everything. And besides, the silver was still there. The mines were still producing. Surely this was temporary. The pattern was now established. Borrow, spend, default, restructure, borrow again. Each cycle, the debt grew larger. Each cycle, prices grew higher. Each cycle, Spain grew weaker. But why? Spain had the gold. Spain had the silver. Spain had the resource wealth that every other nation envied. How was this making Spain poorer? What was happening to Spain has a name now: Dutch disease. Economists wouldn't identify and label it until the 1960s, when the Netherlands discovered natural gas and experienced a similar pattern. But the mechanism is ancient, and it was destroying Spain. Here's how it works. When a nation suddenly gains access to large quantities of a valuable commodity, gold, silver, oil, natural gas, money floods into the economy. That money increases demand for goods and services. Demand increases, but supply can't increase fast enough. So prices rise. Inflation. But inflation doesn't hit every sector equally. It hits non-tradable sectors first: services, construction, real estate, domestic goods. These are things you can't import. If you want a house built in Madrid, you need Spanish workers. If you want a meal in Seville, you need Spanish cooks. So wages in these sectors rise fast. Meanwhile, tradable sectors, manufacturing, agriculture for export, crafts, face international competition. A Spanish clothmaker competes with Flemish clothmakers. A Spanish winemaker competes with French winemakers. As Spanish costs rise, Spanish producers become uncompetitive. So what happens? Capital and labor flow out of tradable sectors and into non-tradable sectors. Why struggle to manufacture cloth when construction pays better? Why farm for export when you can sell food domestically at inflated prices? The productive base of the economy shrinks. This is exactly what happened to Spain. The silver inflow drove up domestic prices. Spanish manufacturers couldn't compete with foreign goods. Spanish industries closed. Spanish workers moved into services or left the country. The economy hollowed out. By 1600, Spain was a paradox. It was the richest nation in Europe by monetary measure. It controlled the silver supply. But it was one of the poorest by productive capacity. It imported almost everything. It manufactured almost nothing. Its wealth was entirely dependent on continued silver extraction from America. And here's the cruel part. The Crown became addicted to this system. Why develop a tax system when silver shipments provide revenue? Why invest in industry when imports are cheap and easy? Why build institutions when you can simply wait for the next treasure fleet? The Spanish government took the path of least resistance. But the silver created obligations faster than it created capacity. Philip II wars were expensive beyond imagination. The Army of Flanders, the Spanish force occupying the Netherlands, cost more each year than the entire royal revenue. The Mediterranean campaigns against the Ottomans were similarly expensive. The invasion of Portugal, the war with England, the support of Catholic forces in France. Each war was justified. Each war seemed necessary. But each war assumed the silver would keep flowing. And for a while it did. The production from Potosí peaked in the 1590s. Silver poured into Spain. Philip borrowed against it. By 1596, debt service consumed so much revenue that Philip couldn't function. He declared bankruptcy for the third time. 40 years after the first bankruptcy, the bankers restructured again. What choice did they have? But now a different mechanism was emerging. The bankers realized something sophisticated. They didn't need Spain to pay back the principal. They just needed Spain to pay interest. As long as the silver kept flowing, the debt could be perpetual. Spain would pay interest forever, and the bankers would profit forever. This was financial innovation. Medieval lending assumed debts would be repaid. But the bankers developed a new model, permanent debt service. Spain became not a borrower, but a tributary. A nation that sent wealth abroad indefinitely, not as conquest, but as interest. 20% of loan agreements Philip signed included provisions for handling earlier defaults. The bankers knew Spain would default. They priced it in. Default became part of the business model. Lend at high rates, accept defaults, restructure, lend again. The bankers were extracting wealth more efficiently than any army could. And Spain? Spain kept spending, kept borrowing, kept fighting wars. Because the alternative, admitting the system was broken, was politically impossible. To stop borrowing meant acknowledging that Spain couldn't afford its empire, that the silver was an illusion, that the wealth was destroying them. So they didn't stop. They accelerated. By 1598, when Philip II died, interest payments consumed 40% of total royal income. 40%. Not spent on military, not spent on infrastructure, sent directly to foreign bankers as interest on old loans. Philip III inherited this system. He declared bankruptcy in 1607. Then Philip IV declared bankruptcy in 1627, then again in 1647, then again in 1653. Each generation of Spanish kings inherited the silver mines and the debt trap. Each generation made the same choices. Each generation weakened Spain further. The Spanish called their empire's decline la decadencia, the decadence. They blamed moral failure, military defeats, bad luck. They didn't understand the mechanism. They didn't see that the silver itself was the poison. By the 1640s, the mechanism was no longer hidden. Everyone could see it. Spanish power was crumbling. The Netherlands had successfully rebelled and won independence. Portugal rebelled in 1640 and broke away. France was winning the 30 Years' War. The Spanish military, once the most feared force in Europe, was defeated repeatedly. But the breaking point wasn't military. It was geological. The silver mines of Potosí began to decline. After nearly a century of intensive extraction, the richest veins were exhausted. Production fell. The treasure fleets carried less each year. And suddenly, the mechanism reversed. For a century, Spain had lived beyond its means, subsidized by American silver. When the silver declined, the subsidy disappeared. But the debt remained. The obligations remained. The interest payments remained. Spain faced a choice: develop a real economy or collapse. It chose neither. It couldn't develop an economy quickly. That takes generations. It couldn't collapse. That would mean admitting failure. So it stagnated. The Spanish crown debased its currency, mixing copper into silver coins. This created inflation without wealth, the worst possible outcome. Prices rose, but real wealth didn't. The population grew poorer. By the mid-17th century, Spain was experiencing depopulation in some regions. People fled to the colonies or to other European countries seeking better opportunities. The sophisticated trap the bankers had built became visible. Spain owed debts denominated in silver, but Spain no longer had silver. The mines were declining. The economy had never been developed. There was no industrial base to generate wealth. Spain had to continue paying interest to foreign creditors, but it had nothing to pay with except more borrowed money. This is the moment when a debt trap becomes inescapable. When you borrow to pay old debt, you're not financing anything productive. You're not investing in future growth. You're just delaying collapse. Every new loan makes the problem worse. But stopping means immediate default. Spain declared bankruptcy in 1653, then again in 1666. 9 bankruptcies in 109 years. Each time, the creditors took more control. Each time, Spain lost more sovereignty. The empire that had once controlled half the world was now controlled by its creditors. Not through military occupation, through financial necessity. The bankers didn't need armies in Madrid. They had something more powerful: Spain's dependence on credit. By 1700, when the Spanish Habsburg line ended, Spain was a hollow empire. It still controlled vast territories in the Americas. It still received silver, though much less, but had no real power. Its military was weak. Its economy was underdeveloped. Its government was paralyzed by debt. The gold from America hadn't made Spain powerful. It had made Spain weak. The silver hadn't built an empire. It had destroyed one. Here's the sophisticated truth. Everyone understood what was happening. As early as 1568, the French philosopher Jean Bodin published an analysis explaining that the influx of American silver was causing European inflation. Spanish intellectuals and administrators wrote reports warning the crown about the dangers of resource dependence. The bankers certainly understood. They were engineering the debt trap deliberately. But nobody could stop it. Why? First, the silver created incentives that trapped everyone. The crown couldn't refuse the silver without losing power immediately. The nobles couldn't refuse the imports without lowering their standard of living. The bankers couldn't refuse the loans without losing massive profits. The merchants couldn't refuse the trade without going bankrupt. Each actor, making rational individual decisions, created a collectively irrational system. Second, the system was self-reinforcing. Once Spanish industry declined, it couldn't easily recover. You can't rebuild manufacturing capacity overnight. You can't recreate skilled craftsmen by decree. Once the economy specialized in importing and exporting silver, reversing that specialization would require decades of deliberate policy and sacrifice. No monarch had that kind of time or political capital. Third, the debt created dependencies that became political. The Genoese bankers weren't just lenders. They were allies. They provided intelligence, diplomatic connections, and political support. Defaulting on them meant losing those relationships. The bankers, in turn, couldn't let Spain collapse completely. They had too much invested. So they kept lending, kept restructuring, kept extending credit. They were trapped in the system they'd created. Fourth, the empire itself created moral hazard. Spain's possessions were so vast that foreign powers couldn't let Spain completely fail. If Spain collapsed, who would control America? Who would control the Netherlands, Naples, Milan, the Philippines? European geopolitics required Spain to exist, even as a weakened state. So other powers supported Spanish debt, fearing the alternative. This created a perverse stability. Spain was too weak to thrive, but too important to fail. It existed in a zombie state, technically alive, functionally dead. The silver kept flowing, just enough to service some debt, never enough to escape the trap. The system became permanent. And here's the cruelest part. The people who suffered most understood it least. Spanish peasants didn't understand why bread was expensive. Spanish craftsmen didn't understand why they couldn't compete with foreign goods. Spanish soldiers didn't understand why their pay was always late. They blamed corruption, foreigners, bad luck. They didn't see the mechanism. The elites knew. The crown knew. The bankers knew. But they were locked in a game where the only move was forward. Stop borrowing, and the empire collapses immediately. Keep borrowing, and it collapses eventually. They chose eventually. This is the sophisticated trap. It doesn't require conspiracy. It doesn't require evil intent. It just requires rational actors responding to incentives in a system designed to extract wealth upward. The Spanish Empire became a machine for converting American silver into European banker profits. And everyone who kept the machine running, the king, the merchants, the soldiers, the miners, believed they had no choice. Is Spain's story unique? Was the Spanish Empire's collapse a one-time historical accident? Look at Venezuela. In 1970, Venezuela was wealthy. Not as measured by potential. Venezuela had always had oil, but measured by actual prosperity. High GDP per capita, growing middle class, democratic institutions. Venezuela was called the Switzerland of South America. And it had oil, lots of oil. The oil revenue flowed into Caracas like silver once flowed into Seville. The government spent on subsidies, on imports, on social programs. Why develop complex industries when oil revenue could buy anything? Why invest in agriculture when food could be imported? The economy specialized. Venezuelan currency strengthened as oil revenue poured in. That made imports cheap. Venezuelan manufacturers couldn't compete with subsidized foreign goods. Venezuelan agriculture withered. By the 1980s, Venezuela was importing most of its food despite having fertile land. The country that had oil aid imported food. Then oil prices crashed in the 1980s. Then again in 1998. Then again in 2014. Each crash revealed the trap. Venezuela's economy produced nothing but oil. When oil revenue fell, the government had no other source of income. It printed money. Inflation exploded. By 2025, Venezuela is experiencing one of the worst economic collapses in modern history. Inflation has destroyed the currency. The population lacks basic goods. Millions have fled the country, all while sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves. Venezuela is wealthy in resources, impoverished in reality. Just like Spain was wealthy in silver, impoverished in reality. The mechanism is identical. Resource wealth drives up currency value. Imports become cheap. Domestic industry becomes uncompetitive. The economy specializes in extracting and exporting the resource. When the resource price falls, there's no fallback. Collapse follows. Economists call this the resource curse. Countries with abundant natural resources grow slower and develop weaker institutions than resource-poor countries. Nigeria has oil and poverty. Congo has diamonds and war. Russia has natural gas and stagnation. Meanwhile, Singapore has no resources and prosperity. South Korea has no resources and development. The pattern repeats because the mechanism is structural. Resource wealth creates perverse incentives. Governments stop needing to tax citizens, so they stop being accountable to citizens. Industries stop needing to compete, so they stop innovating. Economies stop diversifying, so they become fragile. And just like Spanish bankers lent to a weakening Spain, modern financial institutions lend to resource-rich countries. They know the resource exists. They know the collateral is real. So they lend. The countries borrow against future commodity revenue. When commodity prices fall, the debt trap closes. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank play the role of Philip II Genoese bankers. They lend to commodity-dependent countries. They restructure when those countries default. They impose conditions that often make the situation worse. They keep the countries dependent on external credit. The system perpetuates. Look at the petrodollar system. When oil is priced in dollars, oil-rich countries accumulate dollars. They invest those dollars in Western financial systems. They become dependent on dollar liquidity. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates or restricts dollar supply, oil-dependent countries suffer immediately. Their sovereignty is constrained not by military occupation, but by monetary necessity. Spain couldn't escape its creditors. Modern oil exporters can't escape dollar dependence. The parallels are almost exact. 16th century Spain mined silver, became dependent on imports, accumulated debt, lost sovereignty, and collapsed slowly over a century. 20th century Venezuela pumped oil, became dependent on imports, accumulated debt, and is collapsing. The names change. The commodities change. The mechanism remains. But here's what most people miss. This isn't just about individual countries making bad decisions. This is about a global system that benefits from commodity dependence. When Spain exported silver, where did it go? To manufactured goods producers, to bankers collecting interest, to European economies that built industries while Spain stayed extractive. Spanish silver financed the Dutch Golden Age, the Italian Renaissance banking systems, the German industrial development. Spain's loss was Europe's gain. When Venezuela exports oil, where does the revenue go? To food exporters, to manufacturing countries, to bondholders collecting interest, to financial institutions managing reserves. Venezuela's economy is extractive. Someone else's economy is productive. The wealth flows from extraction to production. This creates a global division of labor. Some countries extract resources, other countries manufacture goods, other countries provide financial services. Each role seems voluntary. Each role seems rational for the actors involved. But the system as a whole transfers wealth from extractive economies to productive and financial economies. And here's the key. The system requires some countries to remain extractive. If every country industrialized, who would provide cheap commodities? If every country developed sophisticated economies, who would be the market for expensive manufactured goods? The system requires winners and losers. This isn't conspiracy. It's structural. No one designed it deliberately. It emerged from rational actors pursuing individual interests in a globalized economy. But the outcome is the same as if it were designed. Persistent inequality where resource-rich countries remain poor and resource-poor countries become rich. Spain mined silver for 200 years. At the end, Spain was poor and the rest of Europe was rich. The Middle East has pumped oil for 70 years. At the end, what will remain? Likely debt, declining resources, underdeveloped economies, and wealth transferred elsewhere. The invisible hand isn't neutral. It's a mechanism that converts resources into debt, natural wealth into financial obligations, sovereignty into dependence. And it operates today exactly as it did in the 16th century. The Spanish Empire was formally dissolved in the early 19th century when its American colonies gained independence. But the debt didn't die with the empire. The successor states, Spain itself, and the new nations of Latin America, inherited portions of the debt. They continued making payments to European creditors for loans taken centuries earlier. Argentina made payments on debts from the 1820s well into the 20th century. Spain itself continued servicing debts that originated under Philip II. The empire ended. The financial obligations didn't. This is the nature of debt. It outlives institutions, governments, even nations. It persists like a ghost, extracting wealth long after the original borrower is gone. What Spain teaches us isn't about moral failure or poor leadership. Philip II wasn't stupid. He was trapped in a system where every rational choice led to the same outcome. The merchants weren't greedy. They were responding to incentives. The bankers weren't evil. They were operating in their own interests. The lesson is structural. When your economy depends on extracting and exporting a commodity, you are vulnerable. When you use that commodity wealth to borrow rather than build, you are creating a trap. When your currency strengthens and your industries weaken, you are beginning a slow collapse. And when foreign creditors control your debt, they control your sovereignty. Spain had the richest silver mines in the world. Spain declared bankruptcy 9 times. The silver didn't save Spain. The silver destroyed Spain. Because wealth isn't what you extract from the ground. Wealth is what you build with your hands and minds. Today, in boardrooms and government offices, leaders in resource-rich countries face the same choices Spain faced. Borrow against future commodity revenue. Import rather than build. Let industries die because imports are cheaper. Subsidize consumption rather than invest in production. Each choice seems rational. Each choice leads deeper into the trap. And somewhere, financial institutions are ready to lend. They know the collateral is real. They know the resources exist. They're calculating interest rates and structuring loans and offering credit, just like the Genoese bankers did in 1557. The question isn't whether this will happen again. The question is, where is it happening right now? And who will be the next empire to discover that the wealth beneath their soil is a curse disguised as a blessing?